Hello. What I have here is a very old stopwatch, and you can note that the times are in Hebrew, uh, letters of the Hebrew alphabet to indicate numbers. And the very old stopwatch, it was a gift given to me about 10 years ago from a friend that was doing missionary work in Ukraine. And so with the recent event in Ukraine over the last almost month now, I've been keeping the stopwatch as a tangible reminder of Ukraine. I've had the opportunity to go to Ukraine about a year or 2 years after the wall fell, and we flew to Kyiv and then took a really long train ride all throughout eastern Ukraine down into Russia, all the way down almost to Georgia, and spent the whole summer in that region there. Got to meet a lot of people, Ukraine, Russia, in that area. We spent time at the university in the city of Petergorsk, Russia. Got to meet people, students from all over Russia and really outside of Russia in the university town. So the war there, it's a little bit probably more real for me because even here in California, we know people that are from Ukraine, from Russia. We even have friends. And my wife, Wendy, just had one over for a few hours, few days ago, and she's from Ukraine, and she has family in Ukraine, but she also had family, her parents in Russia, and it is tragic because in addition to the demolishing of the infrastructure of Ukraine, the destruction of lives, and the uprooting of several million people in Ukraine, the years-long propaganda against culture in Russia has placed Russia under a bubble to where the only news they get about Ukraine is from state-sanctioned media and reports that portray the Ukrainians as Nazis and the bad guys, and then Russia as the liberators. And so even with the trauma of losing the physical infrastructure, culture in Ukraine, our friend shared the tragedy of the Russian family relationship because their parents in Russia just cannot believe even personal testimony of their adult children of the suffering that they're going through. And so it's also splitting families up as well. The reason why I mentioned the tragedy in Ukraine is that it relates to the topic of this lecture, which is to give you a quick overview and examination of the nuts and bolts of a very short book called Lamentations. It's just 5 chapters, each chapter an individual poem. But if you're like me, Lamentations is something that was never read, not even heard about. The only time I remember Lamentation growing up is having to memorize it as the book that followed Jeremiah up in school and Sunday school and so forth. And that's all I knew of Lamentation. But I've learned that if we are not familiar with Lamentation and then lament in general, that's a testimony to our situation of a privilege, safety, and security that we've lived lives, constantly for a long time under in safe conditions where the trauma that's what's happened to the Ukraine had never happened to us. But when we examine Lamentation very, very carefully, we learn that the trauma of the devastation of your city, the devastation of your institution, churches and theaters, school, hospital, and the uprooting of family, the way of life that's gone forever, but the tragic loss of life, not only of soldiers, but the citizen, and especially tragic or infant and the young. But when we consider those kind of situations, Lamentations makes sense. So if it doesn't make sense to us, it's a testimony to our situation that's very different. So what I would like to do today is address how lamentation can be useful for those like me that have not had that situation of trauma of having to leave home. And I want to acknowledge some of you may have already been through that, and hopefully you'll get something out of there as well, but that's my focus. To help understand how to think about lamentation, it'll be good if you remember my previous lecture on lament in general. So I'm not going to repeat all of that, except to say that in the previous lecture looked at the theology of lament, that God has given us the complete freedom to speak rightly to God of anything. So the book of Lamentation represents the kind of most extreme situation possible to lament about, the loss of everything, and some of the most horrible images, especially of infants dying in war. It's graphically described in the book of Lamentation. So find the book of Lamentation, open it up, or just click whatever digital button you have, open the book, take a quick look, really short, just 5 chapters, 5 individual points. But what really stands out here is that it is poetry, and you don't have to read long to see the tone of lament in the very first verse. For example, I can read to you in Hebrew, but the very first verse begins with the word ekah, and we'll talk about caustic in just a minute. Begins with Aleph. We just ekah. Yashava Badar Ha'ir Batiam. The first word ekah is the word how, or the word alas. But you can tell from the Hebrew that that word incorporates the sound of a cry. Ekah. Yeah, and the most English translation will be something like how, alas, the city just lonely, a world full of people. Now it's empty. So it's a somber tone of lament. And that's really different for us to understand, not only if we haven't experienced trauma, but second, it's a genre. We're not familiar with the genre of this lament. It's a very different kind of genre than we see in the song. But in fact, this is actually typical in the time of the Old Testament. We have, as far as I know, 5 examples of lament written in Mesopotamia by different cities, lamenting the destruction of the city and of their temple shrine, and those are translated in the resource Old Testament parallels that you have access to. So what I would like for you to do is just browse through the city lament from Mesopotamia, just skim through, and I'm just happy if you're just aware that there is such a genre of the destruction of a city, the destruction of the temple. That's very common. So we have 5 we discovered. That means there must have been a whole lot more. So the genre of the book of Lamentation was typical, with nothing new. But I think what is distinct is the content. How does the biblical writer use the genre of city lament? And how does the biblical writer use the devices and conventions of poetry to help explain or describe or to enable an experience of something about trauma? So that's the book of Lamentation. Now, what I want to note is that when you read Lamentation, it is poetry. Now, you remember earlier we talked about poetry on the spectrum. From one end, we have narrative, where you have character, you have dialogue, you have plot, you have setting, and so you have narrative. Poetry, you get further and further away from narrative. You have less plot, you have less character, less dialogue, and then you have more poetic devices. Somewhere in between, you might have like epic poems like the Odyssey, Homer, Iliad, where you do have some narrative. But then Lamentations represent the most extreme end of the spectrum. It is pushing poetry to the extreme limit. There is no narrative devices whatsoever. We have no character, no plot. It's pure use of language and language alone to communicate something about this. And so we see the poetry in Lamentation is exploring the topography of pain, of trauma in every way possible, using all the devices at their disposal. And so what we end up having is the character of emotionally charged poetry in Lamentation. We can see some of that in the English translation, but it really, really comes out when you look at the Hebrew and you read how the devices that occur naturally in Hebrew stand out very, very charged emotionally in the devices that they use. What I want to do is note some of the emotional, some of the devices of poetry that is used in Lamentation. The first that is not obvious in the English translation, but it's really critical to understand structure of Lamentations as a whole, is the use of acrostic. Now, what an acrostic is using the letters of the alphabet as a structuring device, and then each letter will begin a new line. You may have done that sometime in your life. You started with A, and then B, and then D, then D, all the way to Z to begin a new line. Well, when Lamentations uses acrostic as the structuring device for each of the 5 chapters. So each of the 5 chapters is an individual acrostic instruction. Now, one way to note in English, if you don't know Hebrew, is if you understand that the Hebrew alphabet has 22 letters, and each verse begins with one of the 22 letters of the alphabet, then we have 22 verses. So if you look at Lamentation chapter 1, and then you can see it has 22 verses. Chapter 2 has 22 verses. Okay. What I would like to do is just switch to give you the Hebrew of Lamentation, but I'm going to point out, and hopefully you can see how the acrostics appear. But I think you're going to find pretty fascinating that even though acrostic is a structuring device, it's flexible enough to allow the writer of Lamentation to adapt and to alter the acrostic for the purposes of what the writer wants to communicate across the 5 points. So let's take a look at Lamentation as it appears in Hebrew. Okay, this is chapter 1 of Lamentation, and just for your information, Hebrew is written this way. Okay, and so with the 22 verses in chapter 1, so you can see this is verse 1 and this is verse 22. But what I want to point out is in the Hebrew, the acrostic. I'm just going to magnify so you can see the acrostic. And if you already know the Hebrew alphabet, it's a good way to remember. So we have Aleph, Bet, Gimel, then Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin, Ket, Tet, Yod, Kaf, lamed, mame, noon, stomach, iron, pay, study, cough, rate, sheen, and top. So let's have the entire 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, all from the letter Aleph, which is the first one, to the letter top. Okay, so that's chapter 1, 22 verses. What I want to do is look at chapter 2. And if you look quickly, you can see chapter 2 is exactly the same in structure as chapter 1. So we have all the way from Aleph to Tav, and then Tav is right here on the next page. So Aleph to Tav on chapter 2, 22 verses. Then turn to chapter 3. When you look at chapter 3 in your English and you look at the verse numbers, you see that we do not have 22 verses, but we have 66 verses. So what's the deal? Take a look at chapter 3 in the Hebrew. Now, I want you to see what's going on. In chapter 3, we have Aleph, 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 that began 3 lines in 1 stanza. Then, Beit, Beit, Beit in the 2nd stanza. Gimel, Gimel, Gimel. Dalet, Dalet, Dalet. Okay, so you get the pattern. And then when you get to the end, we now understand why we have 66 verses. So here we have Tav, Tav, Tav. So what did the So what did the writer of Lamentations wanted to do with the acrostic? Well, he used the 22 letters for a single line, 1 letter per alphabet in chapters 1 and 2. But now the narrator decided to do 3 lines per Hebrew alphabet. Now, people say, I don't think that's God trying to talk, but I think something pressing my key. But just in case, I'm going to be aware. Okay, now, so 3 letters, 3 lines for each letter. And so a lot of people say, well, there's no math involved in taking a Bible class. And I really enjoy disappointing people that twist from major to math to Bible by giving math problems as part of Bible classes. And so the math problem here is this. If there are 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet and a poem devotes 3 verses that each begin with 1 letter of the Hebrew alphabet, how many verses do we have in all? Well, 22 letters times 3, which is 66, with what we have here. Now, this is not the only time that's happened. You may note in Psalm 119, the same thing is used there, but each letter is repeated 8 times. 8 times 22. So that's your outside class work. Find out how many verses do we have. You can check that with Psalm 119. So chapter 3, we have 3 lines each. And then there's an acrostic. Chapter 4, we go back to 22 lines. Now, I know it's hard to tell in chapter 4. We have 22 verses, but if you look at the Hebrew lines in chapter 4, and then you compare it to the Hebrew from chapters 1 and 2. The lines are longer in chapters 1 and 2. Okay, I mean, in matter of fact, most of the lines you can break into 3 or 4 separate lines. They're very long. Chapter 2 is the same way, long line. So chapter 4 keeps the same 22 line acrostic, and it's also from Aleph, Beit, and then it ends at Tav, that we see right here. Okay, but the lines are shorter. Chapter 5 is very interesting because if you look at your English Bible, you'll see that chapter 5 is also 22 verses. But look at the Hebrew. We said the Aleph is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, but we don't have an Aleph. We have a Dayan. It means Jacob Adonai, remember, oh God, what happened to us. Please look at our suffering. And then we have Noon. And then we have Yo. It's not in order. The acrostic is given up to start each line. And we don't even end with the top. However, we still have 22 lines. So the writer is keeping the 22 line structure of the acrostic, but completely gives up the struggle of figuring out what to say with each letter starting a different verse. Okay, so what does the use of this acrostic device in this way across the 5 chapters, how did that help us understand what the writer is trying to do? If you remember in the last lecture when we looked at Psalm 13, we noted that the structure of poetry is a way to structure or to bring order to the experience of pain, the experience of trauma. As we know, trauma is disorienting, your lives are out of order, you can't even think or process. And so poetry provides a structure, it's a way to process, to structure. When something is terrible, like the destruction of a city and the devastation and killing of everyone in society, young to old, it's extremely difficult to process. And acrostic provides that structure. So often you don't know where to begin. And it's just some way that I usually help if I have clients that are going through pain or trauma. How do I process it? And one would, coming from a Christian perspective, so I pointed them to the Psalms and other places. And I said, maybe you might want to think about writing in a structured way your experiences. And they seem to like that suggestion. So sometimes you don't know where to begin, you're just oriented. So the acrostic, well, at least I can start with Aleph. But then how do you feel? But then there's this word, you. And then the words start flowing once you get that structure. But it's hard. It's very hard to process grief when you're in the middle. So the structuring acrostic gives you a precision, and then you just fill in the rest. So that's what we see in chapters 1 and 2 is one full line, and it's usually in our Bible translated into stanzas of 3 lines. Chapters 1 and 2. Chapter 3 seems to be an intensification where we have 3 lines for every letter, and chapter 3 appears to be the heart. So if you have 5, and then this is the middle, chapters 1 and 2, 22, 22, 66. And we have some of the most moving images and some of the most lyrical words of hope in the middle of Lamentation 23, chapter 3. Then we get to chapter 4, but you're expecting symmetry. Now, remember the book of Job, the same thing with the dialogue with Job's friends. By the time we get to the 3rd round of Job, we're expecting symmetry, but then it breaks down. We learn that the literary structure shows the conversation breaks down. The friends and Job break down, that they are not able to continue. The same thing here. We're led to expect that chapter 4 and 5 will be like 1 and 2, 22 verses. Matter of fact, chapter 4 starts off 22 verses exactly the same way, but they're shorter. They're not as symmetrical. When we get to chapter 5, it's given up. No attempt at all to do the letters of the alphabet. Like all they can do to structure it is just 22 lines, but forget the alphabet. So in the structure of the 5 points, we have asymmetry, not symmetry. That really a very charged way in the structure to talk about pain and suffering, because pain and suffering is not neat, it's not orderly, it's not symmetrical. It comes and goes in ways. There are times where you can structure it, there are times where you can't. So when I read Lamentation and you really listen to the acrostic, it's very moving, it's very artistic, it's a work of art in chapters 1 and 2, in chapter 3. But then it starts to break away, it starts to fall apart. And it comes across, at least for me, in my experience in going through trauma and pain, and when I read through Lamentation, it's almost as if you're trying to structure your pain, and then all of a sudden the pain gets triggered, and then the pain just overwhelms you, and it's all you can do to just hold on. And so chapter 4 is just shorter, following the alphabet. Chapter 5 is all they can do, just to do the 22 lines, and then it's given up. And so there's no ending, redeeming words of hope or praise like we see in Psalm. What it means is for Lamentation, the situation is currently, they're in rubble, it's dire, they're currently in the midst of trauma. They don't see a way out. And so the book ends, pleading with God, please remember us. Have you forgotten us? And it just ends in that way. So Lamentation is charged literature, and one of the ways is the use of acrostic as a structuring device. The second most important device that is really necessary to understand Lamentations is this. Instead of characters that you might have like in a narrator, even in poems that have characters like the Homer Odyssey, in Lamentation, instead of characters, what we have are voices, but the voices do not depict actual people. So it might be helpful to think of the concept of a persona. So the voice associated with a persona. So what would be really helpful is when you read Lamentation, pay attention to who's speaking, and then what voice are you hearing? Look at Lamentation chapter 1, and if you look at chapter 1, verse 1, said, hey, come, how lonely this city. Okay, so that's the narrator. So one voice is the voice of a narrator, and it describes the city in third person, verse 2 is she. Okay, then when we get to verse 12, the voice is changed. But we don't see that in Lamentation, but if you look at verse 12, just read it in English. It says, look and see, is there any sorrow like my sorrow, which is brought upon me? That is the city, Zion, Jerusalem. So this is the female voice. So it's in the first person. Okay, and so you can see how it's the first person. So you want to switch to a female voice. When you turn to chapter 2 for the second poem, we have the narrator speaking again. And then in between, we have the female voice in verse 20, 21. And so there's certain places where the voice is changed, and so you want to look very, very carefully at the voices. Chapter 3, we have a brand new voice. It says, I am the strong man. I am the person that has seen affliction. There's a special Hebrew word there. The Hebrew word is Gaber. It's used in Hebrew in the Old Testament to describe someone that defends the rights of women. And so we have a third voice in chapter 3. Okay, so the main thing to understand Lamentation is to understand the voices that we have Zion portrayed as a woman. The cities in the biblical world were portrayed as women. And so Daughter Zion or Virgin Zion or Jerusalem is the female voice. We have a narrator that describes someone that can witness the suffering. And then we have this strong man or the person that's the rescuer and defender of women in chapter 3. So you want to pay attention to the voices in Lamentations as you read through the different points there. There are a lot of other poetic devices, but because Lamentations is to the extreme, they're pushing language to the limit. They heavily use wordplay and poems, other structuring devices like inclusio, figures of speech, parallelism in different ways. And it is a work of art. And if you don't know Hebrew, one of the best ways to appreciate is you read a commentary where a specialist in Hebrew may describe some of the devices for you. The one resource I highly recommend, I think, for most of you in this class, it's fairly user-friendly. It's this one called Lamentation and the Tears of the World by Kathleen O'Connor at Columbia Theological Seminary in Atlanta, specializes in Lamentation as well as Jeremiah. But she wrote this for ministers and just for highly interested non-specialists. And what I like about this is it's in two parts. The first part is walking you through each section of Lamentation, one chapter per chapter in Lamentation, and then O'Connor provides a fresh translation. Okay. And then she even put the Hebrew, you can see the acrostic. And so her translation is translated in a way to help you understand the poetry of what he was doing. And then she provides a short discussion of the devices there to help us understand Lamentation. And she paid attention to the voices, to the acrostic, other features. But she doesn't stop there, because when she's done doing the commentary on all 5 points in Lamentation, the second half is a theology. She reflects on what we learn when we consider all 5 points as a whole. And you can see a theology of witness. It's what O'Connor considered to be crucial in Lamentation. Yeah. So this is highly recommended. And of course, you're not going to agree with everything she says. I don't, but I think it really a good way to guide you into working carefully through the book of Lamentation. Okay, now I think what I want to do is just give you just a quick look at a couple of the main emphases when we do read Lamentations carefully. And I want to point out how this is also conveying important truths about the nature of trauma and how we as readers can learn about trauma, especially if we haven't experienced it ourselves. We haven't experienced the destruction of a city and exile ourselves. How can Lamentations help us? When you read Lamentation, what stands out at the very beginning is probably the worst pain of all. You would think the physical pain would hurt, the psychological pain would hurt. But what seems to be the most painful of all is the denial of your pain. It's for people to fail to acknowledge, to ignore, or to minimize your pain. And so Zion, this woman, the one thing she wants is for people to see that she is suffering. And so take a look at Lamentation chapter 1. And I want you to look at the emphasis in verse 9. We see the quotation of Zion, "O Lord, look at my affliction." In verse 11, "Look, O Lord, and see." Look at verse 18. "Hear, all you people, behold my suffering." Verse 20. "See, O Lord, how distressed I am, my stomach churns." Okay, that's just in chapter 1 alone. And that the article claim is this: pain needs a voice. Pain needs to be heard. If the pain cannot be exposed, the healing can't begin. So if people deny the pain, they deny that it's happened to you, how can you be healed? And then the pain continues. So the cry to see the pain, to acknowledge its existence, to validate that the pain has occurred, that is something we all really need to take to heart, because often when people share their pain, it's not uncommon to disregard, to minimize. For one reason, maybe we're uncomfortable in church. Another may be more malicious. We don't want to talk about it. There was a really sad example in my life where I had a coworker a long time ago, probably 20 years ago now, and she was in her 40s, I think. But her whole life, she was obviously sad and trauma, and how she presented herself. But she sat next to me. But she shared with me growing up, her father was a very well-known preacher, not Church of Christ, it was a different denomination. She was sharing that openly with everyone, so it's not a confidentiality thing. But she said her father regularly abused her growing up. But then when she got older and she realized what was done to her, and she wanted to heal, she was ostracized from her family, from her mother, from her siblings for a long time, because they could not reconcile this image of this famous, preacher, someone that everyone beloved that they know, could do something like that to their daughter. And so the family as a whole excluded her. And then she continued in pain. And I can tell you, the one thing she would want most of all is people to say, this happened to you. This was wrong. So allowing that pain to have a voice is the basic, the least of what we can do. Recently, we're getting better. The Me Too movement is an example there of this momentum building thing. You know what? We need to acknowledge when we've been hurt, when we've been attacked, when we've been abused. So people like Bill Cosby and others, it is horrifying when we find out the pattern of abuse and the extent they're able to get away with it. And it is dismaying to see just about every system usually has some mechanism of marginalizing and silencing the harm, from Catholic Church, the Baptist churches, the Boy Scouts, I'll be on and on, Penn State University. And these are just top of my head because it's just so common. And then when victims come out, and these are boys and girls, men and women, what's the response? This did not happen to you. You're just looking for making to ruin someone's life, that kind of thing. So we need to carefully consider not individually, but structure of life, family, where we work, organization, do we allow the voicing to be heard so that healing can begin? So that's the one major thing in Lamentation. And then related to that is the response or lack of response to the voices. And that is indicated in the concept of comfort. So Lamentation has a theme of comfort. If the voices are stifled, we do not have comfort. There is no comfort. And the implication is if I can be comforted, that's going to help with the healing. But comforting cannot take place unless the voices are heard. So I want you to look and see how the language of comfort is also used and it's intertwined with the call for the pain to be seen. So chapter 2, verse 2 of chapter 1, chapter 1, verse 2. Zion, she has no one to comfort her. Verse 16 of chapter 1, a comforter is far from me. Verse 17, no one to comfort her. Verse 21, no one to comfort me. So chapter 1, very short emotionally. The call of the graphic nature of pain and the call for God to see, for others to see. And the request for comfort, they're not getting the comfort because people are denying the pain. If you open your eyes to the pain, it's hard not to be moved. This is one of the reasons why the war in Ukraine is so important for the people in Ukraine to send out images and testimonies of the suffering that are happening to fight against the propaganda that we have of Russia that, no, this is not happening. In the city of Mariupol in Ukraine, the infrastructure was basically demolished and communication was impossible. There was a very moving account from the last journalist in Mariupol before they had to flee, was documenting and taking pictures, but it was risking their lives to find out how to charge your iPhone and to find a Wi-Fi signal so they can upload images, especially here with the hospital being destroyed. Okay, we're talking hospital civilian infrastructure being demolished, and this was being denied. And so the reporter had to find a Wi-Fi spot, and some of the pictures would take hours to upload because of the weak signal. Then the police found out, the Ukrainian police, what the reporter was doing, and the police moved heaven and earth to get the reporter to the resources that the police had so that the reporter could upload. And you know that the reporter was kind of hesitant to take the police away from their duties, but the reporter reported that the police told him, no, right now, this is the most important thing that we can do at this moment, is to get these images and to get the testimony out for the whole world to see. And so that's the basics of trauma, the urgency that the police and the people knew was, if we don't get the word out, it's going to be denied. So exposing the pain, making sure people can see the pain, that's step number one. That reminds me when Dwight Eisenhower, the general, when Eisenhower first encountered a concentration camp and saw the horror and the horrific condition of the people there, the dead bodies, people in near death. Soldiers were just thrown up. They were sick in encountering the pain and the devastation. Lamentation mentioned how the witness of pain, the witness of suffering of others can make you sick and make you throw up there. And Eisenhower knew that it had to be documented immediately. And then Eisenhower went into the German communities and made the Germans come. The civilian, the citizen. For one, he wanted the citizens to see what was happening in their community, to see what was going on. And then he made sure to get the film to document all of this. And that film is now in the archive of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and I'm sure it's on YouTube now. But that's just kind of nature for the pain and suffering era. We have to make sure that this is documented, it is affirmed, it is validated, not just for us, but for posterity. Because why? Because malevolent forces in systems, in family, individually, malevolent forces will erase, will deny, so that the trauma continues, and then the status quo continues. That's why the urgency of the Holocaust Museum was built, because for years, building of a museum was kind of anti-Jewish. But Ellie Weigel, the survivor of the Holocaust, there, this was a rare one-time moment that we have to just tell the world to remember. Weigel, what was decisive for Weigel was the concept of witness. Weigel said, we have to bear witness. We have to testify and bear witness so that the pain is exposed, so that this can't happen again. And so that leads to the third emphasis of Lamentations, which is the witness. And so the first was the desire to see pain, the pain to be acknowledged. The second is to provide comfort, by acknowledging the pain that this has happened. The third is the witness, especially for those that observe the pain. If you have seen trauma, if someone told you about trauma, what do? Well, this is a voice in chapter 3, and it's a paradigm here. And in chapter 3, it is a new person, not the narrator, that I am the man. But it's a special Hebrew word. I am the special person that defends the rights of women, children. And then note what he said. He said, I am the man who has seen affliction. So this is not, I have experienced affliction. I have seen the affliction. And then this man called on God to see. And you can read that here. And then he protests to God, verse 42, God, you haven't done anything. You have not forgiven. Okay. And then verse 49, the man grieved for the affliction that he had seen. My eyes flow without respite, without ceasing, until the Lord from heaven looks down and sees. My eyes caused me grief at the fate of all the young women in my city. I called on your name, O Lord. And so on and on. It plea, this protest, which what we saw in Psalm 13. It's a typical lament, but it's more charged here because this is the suffering of intense trauma, of destruction and devastation. And this person witnessed, but when the person witnessed, did not hide it. They did not try to objectify, to rationalize. The way the witness responded is yes, to think of what it means to be God's people, the way God had pain, the way God chose us to deal with pain. When you witness the pain and you see and validate the pain, you don't just end there, you embrace the pain. You make the pain your own. And so this witness took the pain, embraced it, and the witness was weeping constantly. Then the witness entered into advocacy, advocating for others, advocating to God on behalf of the victim that is suffering. To me, that's the essence of what it means to be God's people. This is what following God and being a Christian is all about. This is the heart of the cross that is commemorated every week on Sunday. The exposing of pain, questioning, my God, why have you forsaken me?" to protest to God. But Jesus was a witness. Jesus embraced the pain and bore that pain, and was calling God to see that pain. Why? Because Jesus shows us what it means to be human. Jesus, as a human, experienced trauma the way humans experience trauma, the denial, and calling for that witness. But Jesus did it as a witness for us and called us to do the same. It is a high challenge. We have failed miserably at churches to do so. And the challenge is, how can we, in our lives, in our worship, create churches to be a safe place to expose pain, where people can say, "This happened to me, this happened to us, this happened in our community, in our society," and they need to be affirmed and validated by witnesses that will embrace that pain and provide them comfort, and to advocate for healing, whatever that will look like, not only for churches in our communities, but worldwide. So when we hear of Ukraine, when we hear about the Uyghurs, in China, or the Rohingya in Myanmar, and just about every place of the world, there are reports of genocide, of the attempt to erase the existence of people simply because of their religion or their ethnicity, and to bring that to awareness at the heart of what it means to be God's people. So it's actually more basic than that. What it means to actually be human, to witness pain, to provide comfort, and to advocate for healing. That is what Lamentations is. And Lamentations is a performance, it's art. It's a way to allow the voices to be heard and experienced, to bring the emotions in us. It's designed to charge us with the emotion so that we can begin to understand the importance of the embrace of pain. Lamentation is not a book to be used lightly. You, for example, used the book in their annual ritual called 9th of Av, where they commemorate the destruction of the temple. They and actually make very good sense for Lamentations in Judaism. In Christianity, we have a hard time with Lamentation because we usually have not experienced the trauma. But Lamentations is good, especially if you're in ministry or you want to understand the Bible really well, to understand trauma and to know that it's there, because you will witness and experience pain. People are going to share with you their own pain, their own suffering, and their own trauma. And we often don't know what to do. We're paralyzed with fright. We're frightened. We're paralyzed. Sometimes we ignore it. It makes us uncomfortable. But Lamentation challenges us. It's not that difficult in terms of what should I do if someone's suffering, if the community is suffering. Listen, let them share. I mean, that's it. Validate it. It happened to you. And then that alone is comforting. Don't underestimate the power of allowing the voices to be heard. And then ask what you can do to make it better. What is some advocacy you can do to do that? And when we do that, then we are well on our way to allowing the poetry to do what it's intended, to help shape and mold us into the kind of people, the kind of churches that God has envisioned. And my prayer is that we all continue to be conformed to that vision, to the image of Jesus consistently. And God bless.